Hello everybody to the start of a new series called Life in Space. And the actual presentation is a primer, so I'm gonna introduce and lots of things and raise lots of questions, but maybe not answer all of them. This will be done later in single presentations of single topics, but here I just want to give an overview of thoughts that pose themselves when you think about life in space. First, under this title page, we see the three kingdoms of life that we have on Earth, the most important of which being the bacteria, and then the higher plants on the right side and the animal kingdom on the left side. We tend to think of mammals when we think of animals, but of course we are mammals. But if you count the number of certain animals on Earth, you will find lots more beetles than mammals, actually. So, a short overview of some topics that we're gonna talk about in this long presentation. Main issues of the research. What do we know from extrasolar planets? Then what does it look like in our own solar system? Mars, Venus, icy moons, comets, and asteroids, dwarf planets. Just very short. What are basic requirements of life? That's a bit a hard question because we basically know only one planet with life, so we can't compare yet. But there are some ideas there. Life on Earth, very short history, but it's very instructive for looking at life in space. What was developed here on Earth and what has come directly. This is what people mean when they say panspermia. There's the idea that life came fully finished, and there's the idea that the whole process of building life happened on Earth, and there are also some middle ways. And then some hints for further thinking. I'm not sure if they will be in this presentation actually. Main issues. The definition. What is life? That's again this thing. I don't know where this came from, but some people say I can't define, but I'll tell you when I see it. But this, of course, is not a good definition because what we need especially are biomarkers. So signs of life that we can see from far away, which is what we are in space, far away from any potential life. Oxford Dictionary gives us some hints what we need. We need growth, we need reproduction, we need functional activity. What is functional activity? That needs lots of theory to say what functional is. It probably refers to evolution, Darwin's evolution theory, and when is something I do functional and when is it dysfunctional or non-functional. We won't discuss this here. And continual change before death. And I will later make a presentation about dissipative and conservative structures, which gives the opportunity to define it a little better, because the best model of non-life that is a dissipative structure is actually the fire. And then comparing fire to animals, you can more or less try to better define what is life, because fire is not life. But it has certain of these features. Then more issues in the search for life. There is this Drake formula, this very bad formula for but very bad formula. What is bad about this formula? It's kind of logical. Somebody just before lunch break or so, he wanted to give us a formula for the number of technologically advanced civilizations in our galaxy, and then made this product of many factors. And the problem is we know only few of these factors, and the rest has very large errors. So, and when you have this form of formula and errors in each term, the resulting error will be huge. That's the problem with this formula. This more or less just says how many stars are there in the galaxy, how many planetary systems, how many of these have a good environment, which we'll see later what that means, and in how many does life actually appear. And this is especially a very unknown factor. When is there intelligent life? We have just a small hint from the Earth, but we don't know much about this. And which intelligent life forms are willing or able to produce interstellar communication, which for our purpose means radio waves. But maybe there are completely other possibilities, but for humans it's radio waves, more or less. This started, I think, in the 50s of last century, these SETI projects, when people sent radio messages into globular clusters of our galaxy. Why to the globular clusters? Because stars there tend to be very old, and there has been much time to develop intelligent life. That's why people send these messages to globular clusters, but they're relatively far away. And if these people, in quotes, these people listen to our signals and respond immediately, it will be a matter of 10,000s of years until we get an answer from the globular clusters. And the last factor is how long does the civilization release signals. So it could be that once we respond to signals we obtain, the civilization that sent the first signal is already gone. We don't know about this. The galaxy is relatively large. Why did Drake just look at our galaxy? That has a simple and compelling reason. There will practically never be a possibility to go in other galaxies. The galaxy is more or less our world when it comes to looking for life. But what should we look for? Should we look for water? Should we look for methane or for radio waves? Are we looking for intelligent life only, as Drake suggests with this formula, or are we looking for simple life? And there's this circularity here. We don't know what life is, so we give a definition. This gives us biomarkers that we can look for, then we look for the signs. And once we have these observations, we may revise the definition of life, because the more we know, the better we can define it, because we know only life on Earth, and much of the life on Earth we don't understand yet. There's the anthropic principle, which is statistical bullshit. It says we have one example of life, so it can't be that improbable to find life, which is statistical bullshit, because you can't conclude from one observation. Of course, it says it's not impossible, but it doesn't give you any value for how often you're gonna find life in the galaxy or outside the galaxy. And there's this famous saying by Enrico Fermi, but where are they? If there are so many planets out there and so many probably habitable planets that have been existed for a while, and probably there's intelligent life somewhere out there, but why haven't they come and to find us? Whether they'd be friendly or unfriendly. This is a discussion I won't do here. Yeah, a short overview on extrasolar planets. Of course, we can't see yet if they have life on them. That's impossible at this stage. But the first step is to just detect these planets, and now in April 2026 we know 6,158 confirmed extrasolar planets, and they're coarsely divided into 3 types, or 3 times 2 types: Jupiters, Neptunes and Earths, and hot or cold. Jupiter are just huge planets, Neptunes are medium-sized, and Earth are small planets, more or less. But the other thing is also, often you have the density, and the density tells you if it's a gas planet or a silicate planet, or maybe a metal planet. One very important and interesting system is the TRAPPIST-1 system, which has 7 planets, of which we will later see 3 are in the habitable zone. I'll explain later what that is. But compared to our solar system, it's very close to the star, because the star is very weak. It's actually easiest to find large planets that circle small stars. Normally, the size of the planet should be correlated with the mass of the star. But there are relatively large planets circling relatively small stars, as in the TRAPPIST-1 system. Here is where it can be found in Aquarius, but you can't see that, practically speaking. We have found some protoplanetary disks, which of course is good for the understanding how planets are being formed. And it's also interesting, for example, that JWST found water in the protoplanetary disks. So if there's water there, maybe the Earth is not so special, because so far the Earth is the planet with the most water, at least in the solar system. We will see more examples later. Then we'll discuss the solar system and the possibilities to have life there. For Mars, this is relatively well known that people were looking for life on Mars and found some processes that we didn't understand, and also some structures in rocks that could have been bacteria, but I don't think it's very convincing at this stage. We know that Mars has had water, as we will see on one of the next slides, but at the moment it's very dry and the atmosphere is very thin and there's no magnetosphere. It's just minimally geologically active still, which we have known only for a couple of years, and it's just one small place on the Mars that makes earthquakes, which is Cerberus Fosse. And if you take all the water that is on Mars, you could cover the planet with a 11-meter layer. That's at least something. It's definitely better than Venus. Definitely less than the Earth. The big question is, could Earthlings live on Mars? And people think, yeah, we can do some terraforming and this kind of thing, but I dreamt of this when I was a child, but now I'm a bit older. I think it's actually impossible because Mars is too small. You can't seed an atmosphere that will stay. You could melt all the ice, and this will give you some water in the atmosphere for a while, but not for very long. That's the problem. These are the examples of rivers that can be seen. It's actually amazing that they still can be seen despite probably being very old. The water is long gone. And partly we don't know if the water flew regularly over longer time periods, or if just ice got melted and then the rivers were built in a very short time and then they were gone again. And this is a nice selfie of a Mars probe with the camera here. And this is a special mineral that this probe discovered in the Java Falls. And it could possibly be explained by iron metabolizing bacteria, but probably it's not the only explanation. That's always the hard thing about this kind of research, because we have our Earth-centered view on things, and if we find a mineral that looks similar to a mineral on Earth that has been built by life, then we think it has been built by life too on Mars, but of course that's no proof, because maybe our fantasy is just not good enough to imagine other processes that could have led to similar structures. Structure building is also something we'll have to discuss, maybe not in this presentation, but later. Then Venus. I mean, Venus is really not a planet you want to land or live on, because it's sort of hell. It has 470 degrees on the surface, a very thick atmosphere, and a rain of sulfuric acid. But it's very, very dry apart from that. But the thing is, people have found phosphine in the atmosphere, and phosphine is one of these biomarkers. So they think either the chemistry in the atmosphere is badly understood in terms of anorganic chemistry, or maybe there is some life form up in the air. And there is this idea that Venus could have been more life-friendly for a shorter or longer time and make some bacteria, for example. And these went into the atmosphere, and once the surface grew so hot, the life stayed in the high up in the clouds somewhere. That's an idea. Hopefully probes will look at this more closely in the future. Then the icy moons have got some attention recently, especially two of them, which is Europa going around Jupiter and Enceladus going around Saturn. We don't know about Uranus's Miranda, which is also a very interesting moon. And the reason people are discussing these moons together with life is they probably have liquid water inside. And they also, the water is liquid because there's a source of heat. And the source of heat in the moons is the other moons, that the gravitational clinch between the outer moons and the planet. So the gravitation more or less presses the moons together, and that's what makes this heat. For the Jupiter moons, it's known that they have a harmonic ratio of orbital times. That's what makes this interaction even stronger. Then comets are interesting because they contain lots of water, although nobody knows exactly how much water. And for a while people thought they could have brought the water on the Earth, which we'll see in a while that it's not very plausible, because their water is different from our water. And some comets are amazingly dry, like Churyumov Gerasimenko, for example. Often if you land on a comet, you find just gravel and almost no ice. And probably the typical comet has maybe 80% gravel and just 20% ice, but the point is, as soon as it comes close to the sun, first carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide gas out, and later the water will also gas out. But if the comet circles the sun for 20, 30, 50 times, probably much of the water has gone, whereas there's still lots of gravel. And we know also that the definition between comet and asteroid is not clear-cut, so asteroids and even planets can sometimes have tails because they are diffusing some volatiles. The other thing is there is some organic smear on the core of the comets, and comets could have organic materials, not only water. So this already shows us maybe they brought not water or not much water, but some organic materials on the Earth. Then asteroids and dwarf planets, sometimes they contain considerable amount of water. They may not be so good as a home base for life because they're often too small. They have to protect organic materials. They have to be in the right distance around the sun, although this also counts for planets. Often they show signs of very violent interactions with others. But we'll see on a later slide that they are very important for bringing water. This is here. If you analyze the water, look at the deuterium by normal hydrogen ratio. So this is shown here. Hydrogen is just one proton and deuterium has a proton and a neutron in the core. And hydrogen 3 has 2, which is tritium, that's radioactive. It's not as stable, has 2 neutrons and just one proton. And neutrons tend to decay, if not in a core, if not safely bound in a core. And here there's this ratio between deuterium and hydrogen, and the 0 point here, the line, is as it is on Earth. And the asteroids have very much the same. Some are a bit higher in deuterium. But this is also a problem about how much water they lost already. Enceladus is also a bit higher, and many of the comets are higher than the ratio on Earth, whereas interestingly the large planets have lower hydrogen, deuterium by hydrogen ratios. But interesting, first people thought comets are impossible, but the Jupiter family comets, some of them have a very similar deuterium to hydrogen ratio. So the question is, where in the solar nebula was the water that finally ended up on the Earth? And the idea is that it was considerably further out and then brought back into the Earth. Maybe level of the asteroids, or maybe even further out. Because Jupiter family means they are dominated by Jupiter, or maybe go to Neptune, but not further than that. But in the past, people think comets are coming from the Oort cloud and then end up as Jupiter family comets. But the question is, why do these long periodic comets have a different D to H ratio than the Jupiter family comets? If they lose the water regularly, they should stay, more or less stay on this level, and not the level they started with. Then another big topic is exoplanets. And here is something I mentioned already. There are Hyacinth planets, which is planets with lots of water and also hydrogen atmosphere. They're very special. And one of these probably Hyacinth planets is K218b, which circles a red dwarf star of the spectral type M. So probably a smaller star than the Sun. And is quite close to us, 124 light years from the Earth in Leo. Not in low Earth orbit, but in the constellation of Leo, the lion. And it was discovered by the Kepler satellite that is shown here. This is a staring satellite that just focused on the same corner of the sky and looked for small dips in brightness of stars. And if these dips are regular and the star is not a double star, then probably there are some planets around. That's the way people discover most extrasolar planets these days. Then you can also calculate the size of the planet, but not the mass. and K218b circles the star every 32 days. So it has a short year in a distance of 21.4 million kilometers. But it is in the habitable zone of the star, because the star is a weaker star than our Sun. But it's a large planet, it has 8.63 Earth masses, and its radius is also more than double of the Earth radius. The density is 2.67, which is more or less silicate-based planet, but of course you never know. It could be a mixture between metal and water or things like that. But probably there is silicate on this planet. And there was a series of papers that looked for biomarkers. Actually, I made a second presentation about this, and you will be able to find it in the same playlist. So I had to look up the word. And on this planet, the molecules found mainly are methane and CO2. And the methane is statistically very safe, and the CO2 also, but the authors also claimed that there's di-methyl-sulphide, DMS, and this counts as a biomarker. So on Earth, practically all the DMS is produced by algae. And then people think, oh yes, watery planet, and DMS, maybe there are algae there. But the critique was quite strong, partly because it's not fully clear if there is an ocean there. And the other thing was that they said it's not safe to assume there is DMS, because also other gases could have made the signal and explain this curve. As I told you in another presentation, near infrared, or in general infrared spectroscopy, is quite a hard thing to do, because you have to assume a mixture of molecules that explains, and the lines are actually overlapping, so it's hard to tell exactly. But 2 years later, the authors gave more data that also looked at the middle or longer wave infrared, and then they could harden the assumption that there are DMS and maybe also DMDS in the atmosphere of this planet. This is a typical example for a shine-through spectrogram. So you take the planet that is in front of the star and you take the star alone, and then you compare these two spectrograms. So what do we need for life? And if you ask this question, somebody will ask you counter, what do you mean with life? But as far as we know, we need water, or maybe some soluble that isn't water, but not all the solubles are good for harboring life. For example, alcohol is not good for harboring life because it's semi-polar and you can't build membranes in alcohol, but you can build them in water. Maybe also in oil, but then they would reverse. We will have to talk about membranes in another presentation. And you need energy, because life is a special case of dissipative structures. All life is dissipative. I think this is clear. Sometimes it's combined with conservative structures, like for example a snail that has a house. Then the house would be the conservative part, and the snail would be the dissipative part. I'll explain this in a later presentation. And you need a more or less stable environment. Drifts are okay, but it shouldn't change every day. Otherwise, you're gonna destroy the life before it's properly developing. And probably you need time to build structures and to adapt. But this is again, we're back at the first question, what do you mean with life? Because simple structures could be built in relatively short time, whereas complicated structures really need time. Also because development tends not to be linear, but have its quirks and problems. This is also a very interesting slide that I will just shortly show to you and maybe explain well later. If you look in the internet, you always find either geology or life, but the two things are tightly interconnected, so they should be looked at together. When we look at geology, we often think of the ending part, but the Precambric time is very long. And first there was no life because the Earth was too hot. But relatively shortly after the Earth cooled enough, there were prokaryotes. And they're shown here. So bacteria, prokaryotes means they don't have a proper cell core in the cell. And having a core in the cell was a requirement later for building multi-cell life, but also for having to die, actually, as we will see in other presentations. So the prokaryotes were there for a long time, and only towards the end there were eukaryotes. And as you know, humans came at 5 to 12, something very, very late in the development. First there were trilobites and brachiopods, and then, for us very important, the fish. And fish and land plants came roughly at the same time. And then also insects. A bit later than the plants, but probably the flowering plants and the insects came at the same time because they worked together. And then amphibs and reptiles, and then mammals and birds, first dinos, and then mammals and birds in the Mesozoic. And then the mammals, first they looked probably like this, like a chipmunk or something, rodents, and then there were also larger mammals, but only when the dinos had died out, probably. For the mammals, I don't know exactly which ones came when, because I didn't find much data on that. Yes, and as I told you, this is an interesting model. It's just one observation, which is the Earth. But just to remind you, bacteria lived for a long time until more complex life could be built. And this could be typical that you find simple life, but not intelligent life on a given planet. Something we have to keep in mind. Then there are some concepts that I will have to discuss shortly. We also can look at them later in more detail, but for this primer, what renders a planet favorable? We have learned a lot about this in recent years, but we're still at the beginning of this research. Often people define habitable zones, and here is an example for that. The inner parts of a solar system tend to be too hot and the outer parts too cold, which is given by red and blue color, and the green color is more or less where it's interesting to look for life on planets. If you look into the solar system, Venus is not the inner rim of the habitable zone. The climate on Venus could be different. If Venus had more water, then it could be more agreeable. So it's not clear. It could still be inside the habitable zone, but it's not a habitable planet on first sight. And the Earth is right in the middle, and Mars could be habitable if it was a larger planet. But it's practically speaking too small to have kept the gases and the water. So that brings us to the atmosphere. A planet that doesn't have an atmosphere is probably not very good for life, although there could be life deep inside somewhere, like Europa or Enceladus. The star has to be stable. Mostly dwarf stars of late spectral types. So for example, if you look at an O star or a B star, there's simply not much time. The stable phase is very short. Whereas for M stars, they can exist for billions of years. Then are variable stars good? They shouldn't be too variable. Otherwise the climate would be just changing very quickly. But some variability is okay, probably. The sun is also, up to a certain degree, shows some variability. It can have flares. Not all stars have flares. And the later spectral types have much more flares. So an M star has more flares than a G star. The sun is a G star. Then the orbit also has to be stable. There could be planets that change orbits, or the orbits, if the orbits are very eccentric, that's also not good for favorable conditions for life. No larger planets should be too close. If you have a Jupiter in the vicinity, that's not good for your life expectancy on a planet. We'll maybe also discuss this later, certainly in some form. No supernova should be close, which also means there are favorable and unfavorable places in a galaxy to look for life. In the center of the galaxy, probably there are too many supernovae. Even if the star is not huge, it's just too dangerous if you have star explosions of large stars every now and then. Although people think there could have been supernova before the sun was built, but probably not in the 4.6 billion years after that. Supernova can also help to build new stars, and especially to build new stars that have metals, which metals or larger atoms, heavier atoms, which we are built from. Especially these 6 atoms that we are built from. Carbon and oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus and sulfur. They should be present, of course. Maybe some of them are not needed, but For the carbon, that's probably quite important. Maybe it can be replaced by silicium, maybe not, but carbon is probably important. Then moons, they're not a priori good or bad, but they can influence the stability of the climate on a planet. And not to be forgotten, they could also make ebb and flow, ebb and flood. And this could be a great opportunity for life to be built if you have ponds that get wet on a regular basis and the water may not be too salty, then you can maybe develop in these ponds. That's one hypothesis. Nobody has made an experiment over millions of years, but it's computer simulations. Then something that can be discussed is all life the same? Or is it different? Why should all life be the same? For example, if you find life on Mars, why should it be the same as on Earth? Because there may be transfers from or to the Earth. And this is something we can tell once we find life, because all the life on Earth shows some similarities. Like, for example, the amino acids that are the same for all the life forms. Some may not use all of them, but all life forms we know, especially the more complicated, all use the same amino acids, and they also use one protein, similar forms of one protein, to translate RNA into proteins, which is the RNA polymerase. So that gives us the idea that all life on Earth goes back to one form. And this you can only have if you mix well enough. And there is also this funny thing with the selectively turning proteins and fats. And this is also something that could be checked once you find life on another planet. One of the most important discoveries in the recent years was that there are amino acids on planetoids and asteroids like Bennu. I think all the essential ones have been found there. Not all amino acids, but the more essential ones. And people don't assume that they were present from the beginning, but they did develop on Earth. So also this coding, this 3-letter code for the amino acids showed some changes over time. So more amino acids could be integrated than in the very beginning. You can start up with just half a dozen or so, and then the others came by and by until there were 22. This code has 64 words, but sometimes the words mean the same, as you can see here. If you vary the last letter, it always ends up as being serine, for example. Same here for valine. And probably the ones that are broad on this plot are the more important, and maybe also the older ones. And some just say stop, and then the protein ends when this letter comes in the code. So yes, once we find life maybe on Mars or somewhere else in the solar system, we can compare. Maybe the chemistry is completely different, then we can assume it was built in a different place. So we almost made it to the end of the presentation. Conclusions. Is life in space rare or frequent? There are arguments for both. Rare, we haven't found any signals so far, although there are always radio signals that we don't understand, but it's hard to tell if they are made from intelligent sources or if they're still an astrophysical mechanism. Another sort of argument is especially intelligent life forms could be destroyed by catastrophes or wars. And this is a very cynical but very harsh thought, that the more intelligent life is, the easier is it that it will destroy itself at some stage. And this is especially hard if you obtain a signal from somewhere and then you go there, send some people there, and on the way you find out that the life form is not there anymore. Then there are arguments for life to be frequent. For example, that life started quite early on the Earth. We don't know exactly how, but we know more or less when it started. And the other thing is the number of planets in the galaxy is just very high. That we don't know yet, but we know in the stars that are close to the sun, and our methods allow only to see parts of the planets, and we have found so many. So if you take into account that we may not have detected all of them in our vicinity even, and then if you calculate from our vicinity to the rest of the galaxy, must be an enormous number of planets. So each planet more or less is an opportunity for life to be built. But we don't know how narrow the bottleneck is for life to be built. People think life could have been built several times on Earth and destroyed again and built again and destroyed again. But yeah, this also counts for higher life. There is a possible synthesis of these rare and frequent factors. Both may be true, because rare may count for intelligent life and frequent may count for single cell life. Maybe some life forms may even be simpler than single cells, but not found these days. Once the bacteria flourished, they probably ate up everything that was smaller. So that was my short primer of life in space. And of course the whole biology could be subsumed, or many interesting examples of biology could be subsumed under this topic. And I have to admit, I'm not a biologist, I'm just an interested amateur astronomer, but it is a topic that interests many people, so I wanted to also make a series on that, and this is the first presentation of this series. Thanks a lot for the attention.